man. Every time we come on, it's so late for us on the East Coast. I'm exhausted, and then we play the intro, and I watch the intro, and I get stoked again. I just get pumped thinking about all those rituals and stuff. What is going on, everybody? I am Druvor. We are here from the Order of Fire with PH2T3R live. Here with Tormenos, Frater Agni, and CB Robertson, also known as New Store. And today we're going to be talking about freedom of speech. Now, New Store, of course, has written extensively on such topics, and I think recently has had some very good reels on Instagram going over it. So, New Store, you want to kick us off? Give us kind of a premise philosophically for where we're coming from here.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a sort of emotional irony to this, I think, which is that many Americans are very deeply invested in free speech to the point that entertaining challenges to free speech feels like something that should be prohibited. No, we can't do that. But there's something almost sacred to the idea. And it was really the subject that I first really came into my own as an aspiring intellectual studying. There was a period in my early 20s when I actually had the entirety of Christopher Hitchens' Defense of Hate Speech from the University of Toronto in 2006 memorized.
Wow.
If anyone hasn't seen that, you owe it to yourself to go listen to that. It is not just an excellent speech, but maybe one of the best rhetorical performances we've seen in the last 50 years. Like it is top tier rhetoric and argumentation in a debate format. And what Christopher Hitchens does is what he's doing in that speech is challenging a proposed Canadian law that would essentially be a blasphemy law. It would prohibit criticism of religion as hate speech that needs to be banned. And Christopher Hitchens basically goes through the arguments for free speech, particularly for criticism of religion, and points out some of the double standards and ironies. That's like, well, there are the classical arguments for free speech, that the way in which we benefit from open discussion and debate and so forth. But he concludes that amazing speech by pointing out the sort of problem that this creates when you look at these religious texts itself. He says, what happens when you go into the Quran and it says, yes, homosexuals should be thrown off the top of roofs? What happens when you go into the Jewish texts and men are praying in gratitude for not being born a woman? And it has some not nice things to say about non-Jews in a few places. And Christianity, of course, the Bible says that the Jews bring the responsibility for killing Christ on themselves in perpetuity. That might have had something to do with the way history went over the subsequent 2,000 years. What are you going to do about that? He says. So there are all kinds of very powerful arguments for freedom of speech. What I didn't know in my early 20s was that, and I should have picked this up from the speech itself because Hitchens himself points it out, is that this is actually not what the First Amendment defends. What the freedom of speech referred to in the First Amendment refers to is a prohibition on prior restraint. One of the classic and earliest arguments for free expression as we know it comes from John Milton. It's called Areopagitica. It's an excellent, wonderful little, very, very short work. But it's not about not punishing people. It's about not censoring people in advance, because you can't know in advance whether speech is going to be harmful or not. You don't know what the effect is. No one has that knowledge. And Milton also makes the argument that these books are sort of living things. These ideas are living entities, and to limit these is maybe to risk killing or at least damaging something incorporeal, which is a very interesting kind of spiritual argument there, and not necessarily a Christian one, interestingly. But what is protected by the freedom of speech in the First Amendment is this prohibition on prior restraint. The government can punish you for what they say, for what you say. They are not allowed to stop you in advance from saying it. They are not allowed to issue licensing laws that say you need a church-approved license in order to print material in our theocratic country. We can write what we say, and the same founders who passed the Constitution, including the First Amendment, also passed laws that prohibited, among other things, the mocking of the uniform of the armed service.
Yes.
So there's, if you go all the way back, there was no contradiction between those two things in the sense of what was protected by the First Amendment.
No, not at all. And that's an important context to bring up that a lot of people miss when it comes to, first of all, the difference between arguing for the principle of free speech and then arguing for the First Amendment. And Americans definitely have this what I find now. I mean, I grew up with it, but now retrospectively, I look at the way Americans look at the First Amendment, and it seems very strange.
Yeah.
The concept of, I disagree with what you have to say, but we'll defend to the death your right to say it. It sounds great in theory, when you're a teenager and you're reading libertarian books, but once you get people that are starting to advocate for killing you, it's starts to become, why would I defend to the death this person's right to advocate for me and my family being brutally harmed?
Right. And I think it even goes, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that whole concept, that idea of the freedom of speech being completely unlimited, like so many things that we take for granted now, is very new. Like in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the hippies that were saying super, super outrageous things that sued, and when they would be arrested for doing these outrageous things, super disrespectful, rude thing like to armed service and things of that nature, they would openly like, I don't want to say blaspheme, but in the 1700s it would have been called blasphemy.
No, they did performative blasphemy, essentially, against the state and against the native religion.
Debaucherous. I mean,
the like groundwork
Playboy became a thing, right? Like they deliberately took these things to Supreme Court, and it was in the 70s that they set all these precedents.
Well, the groundwork was laid a little bit earlier. There was a case that, and this is why I bring up the Christopher Hitchens speech to begin with, because he opens with the a brief recitation of the history of the Schenck case in 1917.
In 1917? Okay.
Yes, 1917. It was the Hitchens rendition of it. I could do it in a Hitchens accent. Is a bunch of Yiddish-speaking socialists, which literature was printed in a language most Americans couldn't read. A bunch of war pamphleteers basically were saying America should not get involved in the First World War. And this was compared by a certain Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., it was analogized based on something another lawyer had said in a previous case, to being like knowingly and falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. And that's why Christopher Hitchens was making fun of this analogy. Now, what's interesting about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is he's actually the one that gave us the modern notion of free speech as we understand it sort of more colloquially about 18 months later in what was called the Abrams case. It was a very similar case, but in the intervening time, Justice Holmes had two friends. Now, Holmes was a very conservative judge, but his two friends were extremely liberal. One was a professor named Harold Lasky, who was lampooned by Ayn Rand in The Fountainhead, interestingly enough. One of her villains is based on Harold Lasky. And Harold Lasky is also mocked directly in George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, which is amusing. And then there was a judge named Learned Hand. And both of these two legal scholars, we can say, basically convinced Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes to change his mind on what free speech was about, what it was for, and how we should understand it. And in the Abrams case, he basically reversed his position that he had given in Schenck and wrote this great dissent. And there's actually an excellent book that people can look into if they want to learn more about this, called The Great Dissent by Thomas Healy, about that 18-month period, what went into the case, the background of these stories, the characters involved, and so forth. So Justice Holmes' opinion was not how the court ruled, but his dissent became the sort of legal reasoning behind modern interpretations of free speech. And what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years or so, particularly in schools, particularly in high schools and universities, is this new interpretation, this much more, we'll say, liberal in the colloquial sense of the term liberal, not political liberal, but like liberal as in lavish, as an open, expansive sense of free speech. We run into problems. We run into contradictions at times. And the one of the classical points that free speech absolutists try to make is that there's this hard line between speech and action. You know, if I punch you, that's one thing. If I call you names, that's something else. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me unless I call you a pedophile, unless I accuse you of theft, unless I accuse you of rape, right?
Libel.
Any stories about that? Yeah, libel. And what's funny about libel is even Christopher Hitchens believes in libel laws, because he sued the who's the diplomat he was always going on about? The diplomacy author, Kissinger.
Yeah,
Christopher Hitchens sued Henry Kissinger and Associates for libel. I don't know if it was successful or if it was going to be, but they settled first. But the strong case against free speech in the absolute liberal sense is not shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's libel, because libel creates material harm and breaks that idea of a hard line between speech and action. And once you treat speech as an action, well, then suddenly, what's the difference between limiting the way in which you're allowed to move your body? For example, I'm not allowed to just punch you. Is that inhibiting my freedom of movement? Well, in a sense, yes, it is. But we don't experience that as oppression. But if I say, you are allowed to say, I think Islam is false, but you are not allowed to say, I think Islam is a poopy head religion of, whatever. There are reasonable ways. I'm trying to make that as childishly offensive as I can to make the point. Like there are sensible ways of restricting speech that are not that make dialogue better, because the entire purpose of the freedom of speech that we find defended in John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, or John Milton's Areopagitica, or in Jonathan Rauch's wonderful book Kindly Inquisitors, which is another excellent must read, is to create a more vital and alive and active civic culture and conversation, to make people more intellectually resilient and involved, and to develop these arguments further. But what we find in reality is that when this marketplace of ideas is overrun with bot comments that are just spammed out designed to demoralize people, or just like robot generated propaganda lines and that kind of things, we're actually not getting to the purpose for which free speech was defended in the first place. There are certain parameters that are needed in order to get to the end, but somewhere along the way we confused the means and the end. Now, somewhere, I think, Drew, or what you were talking about in the 70s, what happened is free speech, they stopped seeing free speech as a means to a certain end and started viewing it as an end in itself. Oh, I just need to express myself. I just need to be able to say what I want, and not allowing me to say what I want or punishing me for it is oppressing my soul in some way.
And before, there was all the obscenity laws stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Allen Ginsberg's Howl in like 57, that court case, and then kooky ass William Burroughs in 1965, I think, Naked Lunch, that book. That was that free speech to write things that were considered obscene. Why were they considered obscene?
I think News Store hit the wrong button again.
And then later in the 80s, you had Al Gore's, prudish wife Tipper, wanting warnings on every piece of music that said something that she thought was, not cool.
Which made them sell better.
But it's like, who it's like, okay, so obscenity laws, it's like obscene to who?
Right. That's kind
obscenity
of
obscenity is an interesting one.
Yeah, that comes down to really just honesty in terms of what we value as a culture and what is obscene, what's not obscene, because it seems that we only it's the Dune quote, right? How's it go? When you have the power, I appeal to liberal values because it is according to your values. When I have the power, I remove your rights because it's according to my values, right? That's I butchered the quote, but that's essentially how we functioned, right? Where you have one side that argues from what they think is a principled position of free speech, the whole, like I mentioned earlier, I don't like what you have to say, but I'll defend the death right to say it. That whole idea. Whereas the other side will gladly take that and let you defend them when they say horrible things. But then as soon as they have the power, they'll do everything in their power to censor you and shut you down. They'll, try to get you removed from your job, or worse, they'll try to get you thrown in jail. I mean, you look at European countries and the UK, 12,000 people a year are thrown in jail for speech on the internet.
Right.
It's wild. Which, by comparison, by the way,
Russia
had about 400.
Yeah.
So, beating Russia substantially.
Beat China too.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious.
So that I think is where it becomes an issue. I think that one of the things I'm seeing in the discourse now that I'm liking to see in the discourse is people are starting to be honest about, no, there are reasonable limitations to speech, and that is determined by cultural values, right? Like the case specifically I was thinking of in the 70s was, I forget the name of the case, but it was basically a hippie showed up to court wearing a jacket that said F the draft on the back, in giant bold letters. And it was somewhere in the time was conservative California. And the judge had him removed from the courtroom and charged with contempt of court because it was obscene, right? He was openly cursing in court and also insulting the government while doing it. So they sued. They took it to the Supreme Court, and it got overturned, saying that it was his freedom of speech to wear a jacket that said F the draft on the back. And that's just another example of the like you mentioned, Chris, the speech being the end rather than a means to an end.
I mean, that's like a slippery slope, though. Also,
slippery slope has been proven to be real more times than not.
Yeah.
Well,
Really
it's
anymore.
I mean, there's certain parts of the country and at certain times where we're we're all demons. In rural Kentucky, we're devil people, and everything we say is of the devil. And so, if that's the cultural collective, right?
Yeah, it's tricky because there's I think slippery slopes in a couple of different directions here, and obscenity is an interesting one, that I have kind of mixed feelings about now. I used to be like just gung ho, like no, defend absolutely, but you wind up in the same situation where, like, what is this all for again? Do I just want to be able to just spam the chat with like F you, F you, F you, F you, like all the way down and just overload the system? Because that's what we're going to be looking at with particular power in an age of AI and bots and so forth. But I think the principle was true before too. But what we've wound up in is very, very subtly in our shift of focusing on freedom of speech, this prohibition on prior restraint, and also a prohibition on compelled speech, which is also maybe even more valuable, to this, I want to be able to say whatever I want without consequences. In order to make that work, the state and various powers that be, not just the state, have had to compartmentalize and have had to limit reach and to isolate people just in order to make us not just at war with each other all the time. And so what we wound up in the late 2000s, early 2010s was a situation in which we had the feeling of free speech in the 1970s sense, but we had actually lost the freedom of speech in the original sense, i.e., we were being throttled on social media. We were being censored in direct opposition to the original meaning of the First Amendment, but we didn't notice it because we had lost touch with the purpose of it. And so there's a slippery slope in a few different directions here, and not all of it is in the direction of censorship. Some of it is in the direction of what the founders would have called license, that just pollutes the airwaves to the point that no one can say anything meaningful in this space anymore. There's also some language problems where if we're speaking from different value sets or with different understanding of certain words, we'll always be speaking past each other, and the possibility of communication is limited. So there might be some implicit assumptions in the context within which freedom of speech actually works that we might or might not have in a few places as well.
Right. And kind of bringing it back to what we're dealing with now, or at least moving in that direction. A good example of where the issue of unlimited free speech becomes very sticky is communism, right? When you get like what I'm experiencing right now, I'm watching all these kids become indoctrinated by these lefty professors that are openly lying or at best misleading and offering altered premises in order to paint the facts, right? Like I have one professor that will go on about current events, but they will frame the current events with certain premises that are not necessarily true. They're opinion statements, but there are premises that she then used to state facts about current events, and that colors how the students should interpret the facts. If you add that up, compound it over time, you end up influencing these kids to have an extremely left-wing progressive worldview that's not based on reality, and they start advocating and pushing for communism, which then leads up to where we are now, where we have a massive cohort, half the Democratic Party,
not just communism,
revolutionaries that openly advocate for murder.
Yeah, not just that's the important part. Not just communism, because if we were just advocating communism, then it's like, all right, we can do what John Milton and John Stuart Mill says, and arguably what Aristotle says, which is respond to good rhetoric with bad arguments, with our own good rhetoric with good arguments, and then we can let the free marketplace of ideas sort this out. The equation changes though when you brainwash a substantial part of the population with Hitler for 10 years straight, fascist, and say, if something isn't done, if this priest is not gotten rid of, then your democracy is over, your friends and family's lives are forfeit. And the power of repetition overcomes the force of argument. And you end up with people getting shot in the neck. And the purpose of that is to shut down debate. Exactly. So what the classical liberals will bring up in this case is what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance, which is like, well, we want a tolerant society, but if we tolerate the intolerant, then that will create an intolerant society because of asymmetries in tolerance there. So what are we supposed to do about it? Well, and this is Herbert Marcuse saying, well, we have to have repressive tolerance. Yeah. We have to be actively not, and that is a kind of solution. But why are you even still calling it tolerance at that point? Like, it's just a stupid word game. Tolerance is not in the equation at all anymore. Just say tolerance is not a virtue. That's the answer. It is a reductio ad absurdum against tolerance as a virtue. And that is, I think, very unnerving for people like Jonathan Rauch or John Milton or John Stuart Mill, who believe in this kind of idea of a free marketplace of ideas. Because in order to have that, you have to have a pretty strong cultural consensus that is what we want. And we may have different opinions, but we're all in this larger meta game together. And as soon as people give that up, then you're not in that meta game together. And the person who defends free speech and, I disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it, that just loses. Exactly. Because you're up against people who will say, to quote from Karl Marx, if I could quote from him briefly from his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he says, war on the German state of affairs. He's speaking in 1843 here. By all means, they are below the level of history. They are beneath any criticism, but they are still an object of criticism, like the criminal who is below the level of humanity, but still an object for the executioner. In the struggle against that state of affairs, criticism is no passion of the head, it is the head of passion. It is not a lancet, it is a weapon. Its object is its enemy, which it wants not to refute, but to exterminate. For the spirit of that state of affairs is refuted. In itself, it is no object worthy of thought. It is an existence which is as despicable as it is despised, etc., etc. So you're up against people who don't view criticism as a Socratic tool of inquiry, but as a mechanism to destroy you. And that's why you see just this repetition. No one doing a Socratic tool of inquiry will repeat the same thing over and over again. They just offer it once, and if it works, okay, we'll stick with that. If it gets rebutted, then you hang on to the rebuttal. Like St. Christopher going from, one master to the next to see what's the strongest.
So, a free marketplace of ideas requires emotional control and a sort of self situation, because
Yes.
that's the thing, and the repetition is coming from a place of a kind of emotional hysteria, and it's attempting to induce emotion and not thought.
Well,
Yes.
it's interesting because they've done it through relatively benign means. They've created emotional hysteria without using emotional hysteria. So, for
I
example,
don't know.
we all agree that we were the good guys in World War II, right? That's a given. We talk about our, we all grew up hearing war stories from our great grandparents or grandparents, or watching documentaries on the war, World War II, and we all agree that the mid-century Germans were bad guys, right? That were dealt with appropriately for a wartime situation. If you catch what I'm getting at, avoiding YouTube guidelines. Then, in a separate conversation, they label anybody they disagree with as mid-century Germans, right? With no reference to any actual philosophy, no actual criticism. They just blanket statement everybody who we disagree with is a mid-century German. Those two ideas, when you put them together, ends up with a crazy kid with a gun in Utah. Uh,
And it's kind of wild that kind of thing is coming from the sort of little cultural corner where speech is violence, where we're just simply discussing something that they don't understand or are afraid of is a reason to call HR.
right. Well,
You
that's
know,
that's
it,
the logical endpoint of it, right? If criticizing them is violence, they sincerely believe that by criticizing them specifically being the rainbow community, right? If we criticize them, we're causing them to sewer slide, again, avoiding YouTube. They think we're actually killing them by criticizing them. They legitimately believe it's violence. So they think that when they commit violence, they're acting in self-defense and they feel that it's justified.
maybe, yeah. It's the entire culture, the entire patriarchy, it's the entire demiurge of existence that is out to kill them. But it's earlier you were talking, news story, you were talking about, the sort of, what are the results of speech, that there's limits because what could be the result of certain types of speech, what is the effect. And that's slippery too, because there's an extreme where speech that actually is harmless is, the Leviathan of HR departments. They're not just, they're watching for, and it's only about the impact. It's not about the intention, and it can be something very, really mild. But if somebody doesn't like it,
telling people that maybe don't eat Tylenol if you're pregnant. And what are the effects of that? Well, in a few cases, not great.
yeah,
But where does the fault lie there?
yeah. So it becomes only about the impact and nothing about the intention. Where a rational court of law in perhaps 1917 might look at both equally.
Right.
Because and we any libertarianish person knows that there are consequences to behavior, and speech is a behavior. So okay, if you say certain things, there might be a result, but how far do the consequences have to go? Based on the
Right.
intention.
And I think I think you're right. I think it's where that line is a judgment call that there cannot be unfortunately, any strict legal rule that covers all its bases. I was just reading Vox Day's blog a little while ago, and Vox Day has had some interesting things to say about free speech over the last several years too. But he posted, let me see if I can find it. A character named ESR was talking about corporate codes of conduct. And if I could read a little bit, this person ESR, which is I guess a big name in the open source online community, says after 10 years of drama and idiocy, lots of people other than me are now willing to say in public that codes of conduct have been a disaster, a kind of infectious social insanity producing lots of drama and politics and backbiting and negative useful work. Here's my advice about codes of conduct. 1, refuse to have one. If your project has one, delete it. The only actual function they have is as a tool in the hands of shit stirrers. 2, if you're stuck with having one for bureaucratic reasons, replace it with the following sentence or some close equivalent. Quote, if you are more annoying to work with than your contributions justify, you'll be ejected. 3, attempts to be more specific and elaborate don't work. They only provide control surface for shit stirrers to manipulate. End quote. And I think the rules governing what is and is not legitimate speech are very similar, because you can have someone who is, you can have people saying very similar things, which are in one case legitimate and in another case not. The easiest example for me to point back to, Marxists are fond of making Thersites into something of a hero from the Iliad because he's speaking so subversively. He's like undermining the hierarchy and all this. But when you look at Thersites' criticisms of Agamemnon, they're actually very similar to what Achilles is saying. He has very similar criticisms of the king that Achilles has. But Achilles has standing to say them, and Thersites does not. And there's also differences in how things are said that make a world of difference in how it's received and the effect it has on the public. One of the things I'm most proud of in my own time debating people online is for all the criticisms I've made of Christianity, including a whole book and plenty of blog posts and stuff, I've never once, well, maybe like twice by anonymous people who didn't read it, but I've never seriously been criticized of mocking or making fun of Christianity. I've made fun of individual Christians, often for being bad by their own standards, and many other Christians often agree with me on that. Now, I am not a Christian. I have criticisms. I think it is false, but I've never been accused of mocking the faith, and I'm proud of that. And there was a time back in my early 20s where like mocking Christianity was like so cool and so edgy, and it's like, I think one of the big struggles that we face culturally is the effect that comedians have had on the discourse. And this is going to be extremely unpopular to a lot of people, but I think comedy is treated as like the gateway to free speech and the protection of free speech, but it's also the protection of license, and it's also the tool, the foot in the door that people jam in to open the door to the sort of license that makes the free marketplace of ideas dysfunctional. And this is a point that a Christian, C.S. Lewis, has pointed out. It's a point that an atheist, Ayn Rand, in exactly the book that she was mocking Harold Lasky in, points out in The Fountainhead. And it's a point that the pagan Alan Moore points out variously in implicitly though in Watchmen and in his adaptation of Joker, where there's a corrosive quality of comedy, and I think a stand-up comedy culture has that effect too. It just tears things down, and I feel like it's an expression of an ironic culture that doesn't serve society well, that abuses the freedom of speech in the way that, like back in the court days, maybe you had one guy, one jester whose job it was to play this role well and wisely, and not be taken too seriously. Now it's like people treat our comedians like they're philosophers, like they're political theorists or something, like they're the way they look at musicians or actors. It's like, why? Why are we?
Yeah, that's a really interesting take that I hadn't thought of. It ties into the whole recent Jimmy Kimmel controversy, honestly, because his rhetoric, along with Stephen Colbert and a lot of these guys, has been particularly corrosive because, like you're talking about mocking, ridicule has been a tool of subversive revolution elements for a very long time. Orwell made a great example of it in his Minute of Hate, right? It's the idea that whether it's fact based or not, it can be completely baseless. If you just make somebody the object of ridicule, then that's all you need to do. You can shut them down without even having to debate their points. It totally subverts any sort of dialogue about any kind of policies or philosophy or anything of that nature. And that, I think, is why Kimmel is a good example of someone just being completely corrosive. You know, his response to a guy getting murdered was to in turn mock the people that were upset that said person was murdered, right?
Yeah,
And
and it would be
They're
very.
not.
It would be
Colbert
very
and Kimmel
different.
are not funny. They're not funny at all. They're definitely fucking clowns, but they're not funny.
But
I don't want to get into the business of having the state determine who is or is not funny. But for the same reason that we don't, the Areopagitica thing, we can't know in advance what is or is not apt. You know, we could say all the same things about George Carlin, especially in his later years. Terrible, terrible comments, but maybe insightful every once in a while. But it would be very different if someone were saying these kinds of things in a private group of friends,
right,
versus saying them in a public show. And this is where I think there's an inescapability of judgment that ESR gets to, where it's like, you know, at the end of the day, and we all try to avoid subjectivity here because subjectivity feels like, oh, it's just a subjective judgment just means whoever's in power gets to imprison their enemies and protect their friends. Like, well, but that's where we are now anyways. You know, we already have this sort of selectiveness in how we enforce these things. We've been censoring people with a strong, like 95% left-wing bias in who gets shadow banned, who gets kicked off YouTube, and so forth. And it's still kind of true because the moderation bodies in these social media platforms are still largely populated by the same people. It's being corrected now a little bit, but if we just own up and face the inevitable subjectivity of it and make those judgments a little bit more public, not this sort of algorithmic objective, fake objective thing we can hide behind as if, oh, we're just instituting our policies, but not for these people over here. Then there's actually more accountability, which is maybe what we want.
Right. I think that you're touching on the solution, because the question I wanted to kind of wrap things back to is, with our current situation where we have had for decades or longer this unequal enforcement of freedom of speech for a long time under the guise of being objective when it was obviously completely subjective in application, combined with now there's a narrative. It's not true. The narrative is that Kimmel was removed by the government. It's not true. It was advertisers that boycotted, and they were all upset, and then they cut him to avoid facing losses, and then he's back within a week anyway, so it didn't fucking matter anyway.
But it's funny because that's gonna stick. There's gonna be a large percentage of the population that will still remember, oh, the government got him out, and they'll remember that because it's coherent with 100 other lies that were told about the same thing, and you have this self-reinforcing mesh network of belief. Where's your free market of ideas there?
Exactly. It's funny because it's not even logically consistent. If he's back in a fucking week, that's a pretty ineffectual fascist government, right? Like he's back. Colbert is still on for a whole year, even though he was supposedly shut down by the government. It's total false narrative. But the question is, given that we don't have the situation that our whole premise of free speech is based on, right? The reality that our understanding and premise of absolute free speech is based on does not exist. Maybe it never did. Maybe it did in the past. It doesn't now, right? What do we do? What is culturally the path forward? So I agree. I'm not a fan of government enforcement of things like that. But when it comes to advertisers and media outlets saying, "Hey, you're not allowed to advocate for murder," or in the case of federal and state employees getting fired because of advocating for murder or celebrating murder, it's, in my opinion, completely justified for people to lose taxpayer funded jobs for those reasons. And I think any private employer would also be more than justified for that. But then there's accusations of hypocrisy because we used to advocate for absolute free speech, but we've moved past that since the unequal enforcement has become so obvious. So culturally, what's the solution? How do we make that delineation? Because you're right that a subjective delineation leads to accountability, where we have principles we can actually reference when we make these decisions. But what are those principles that we can reference?
Well, I mean, it's tough because we've sort of enshrined the Abrams notion of free speech as a sacred principle. So I think we have to face the reality of the results of that, and say, is this noise what we wanted? Was that what this was about? And sometimes the noise is not just voices. Sometimes it's gunshots and bombs and so forth. If we step back and get a little bit more precise and say, what is it we're trying to defend here? First of all, we're trying to defend some concept of a participating citizen at a civic level. And then maybe at a more individual and personal level, which is what I care about, we're trying to defend what's called the freedom of inquiry, which is not the same as the freedom of speech, but is extremely valuable. And there is a risk, especially in a more technocratic Silicon Valley governed future, of running into a kind of matrix situation where we have freedom of speech, but we have no mouth with which to speak, right? To borrow from Agent Smith, what's the use of free speech if we aren't free to inquire? If every time we search in Google or our own search engines, or even we've downloaded ChatGPT, we have a backdoor, like isolated ChatGPT, but it's got some backdoor that gives the tech panopticon people vision into our houses. Oh, we're searching for things we shouldn't be searching. The limit, turn the dial of his reach on social media down 5 points, and they can sort of control board the energy of different subjects. And we're just participants in a pantomimed, choreographed, fake public discussion, like where inquiry is essentially not possible, or is punished to the point like that. That's not where we want to be either, I don't think. So I think getting more precise in what it is we're defending, because I think the price of defending this notion of free speech is just the ability to vent, to say what you want without consequences, came with some civic costs in the forms of censorship that are quite high. And we're seeing, as far as foreign influence goes, in some cases, we're seeing it in Britain very badly, as Drew Vor, as you brought up earlier. But I think getting more precise with what it is we're trying to protect and why will go a long way to helping us, and not being satisfied with these cliche phrases like free speech or democracy or fighting fascism, or these meaningless phrases. Most people couldn't say what they mean when they say free speech. And maybe that's accurate. Maybe free speech describes a certain ethos that isn't necessarily bound by its rules. And that's fine. I'm all here for that kind of free speech as a sort of mode of civic participation. But that's something for theory. That's not something for the law. And I think when we're talking about cases like Jimmy Kimmel and Charlie Kirk and Destiny and things like that, we're talking about law. We're talking about, well, what do we do about this? And the thing that's maybe even scarier than all of this is Matthew Crawford, in his wonderful book, The World Beyond Your Head, describes a potential world in which automated advertising or attention grabbing becomes so ubiquitous, so overpowering if we open our eyes to the world around us, that we just shut it all off, that we close in, that we turn inward into our phones or our books or the insides of our apartments, because you open the windows, you drive out into the world, you buy something at the store, and you're overwhelmed by people who are grabbing at our attention. Because that's also something you can do with speech. And you can do it at industrial scale with the use of AI and robots and stuff. So maybe the freedom of speech requires a conversation about an attentional commons and an ownership over our own attention that hasn't really been had yet. And I think the way political discourse would happen would change quite a bit, because a lot of political discourse is imposed upon us. We're sucked in like eyeballs on a train wreck on a lot of this stuff, and in a way that's not healthy.
Not at all, because that's how you get people who would normally be completely politically disengaged becoming violent radicals, right? Because of this constant.
And the tragedy of people who are intensely politically engaged is that you get so locked into what's happening in the moment, and it's a never-ending stream of happenings, that you lose track of what was the follow-up with what happened 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Did we ever find out what the case was? Oh, the initial story was completely wrong. It was completely backwards, you say. Oh, well, that would be good to know. But you're so wrapped up in the new thing that you lose a sense of depth. You lose a degree of understanding in the FOMO of being up to date. That's why I take a tremendous amount of slightly sadistic pleasure out of reminding people about Coney 2012.
Yeah.
And make Coney famous. It's so fun to watch people cringe when they remember, oh, yeah, I remember holding up signs and doing all that. It was a total fraudulent operation. It was like one of the original rug pull social media things. But it's valuable to do. And in the days after the Charlie Kirk shooting, everyone had something to say about it, obviously. And it makes sense. To me, it seemed like a good time to remind people to go back to old books, to take your eyes and mind off current events, at least for a moment. Read Gorgias, for example, or The Republic, or go back to an old story for a change. And I think it's valuable to study politics that way in general, to look back, look at things that were going on 100 years ago or older, and that can give you a little bit more depth, because no one's getting caught up in the oh, what's new, and forgetting the follow-ups in what was going on with the Peloponnesian War,
Right.
And there's a degree of detachment there too. Even as Curtis Yarvin points out in the Civil War, if you say, well, the wrong side won, it doesn't have the emotional weight as saying someone said on the internet says the wrong side won World War II. That will maybe turn some heads. But saying, oh, the wrong side won in the War of the Roses, people are you picking sides in a lacrosse team? Why? And it can allow you to approach things with a little bit more detachment and curiosity that I think gets overpowered by the tribalism of the moment-to-moment urgency of politics.
Yeah, it can also help you see how a lot hasn't changed. How there's just these cycles of, even,
Yes.
uh, earlier today, I was watching a Star Trek original series episode, and I was like, everything, so many of these things on this show are leading back to the Oresteia. It's like, the episode was about
Yes.
like a blood feud and which direction it should be taken and what is justice. And I was like, there you go. We've got a Greek drama playing out in 1968 sci-fi. Yeah, and it all just, and past episodes we talked about the world was ending when Reagan was elected.
Yep.
It was the end of everything. All freedom was going to collapse. Democracy was going to be over. There was going to be a nuclear war. Didn't happen.
It's funny. We're talking about ancient Greek stuff. I mentioned pushing people towards Gorgias, and the reason I was pushing people towards Gorgias because Socrates creates an argument that bad people can't really harm the just. And I don't know if it's persuasive or not when you think about it for a while, but there's something satisfying in seeing, Charlie Kirk die and getting all riled up and then going back to read Gorgias and hearing Socrates, who we know the outcome of Socrates, say, no, the just person can't actually be harmed by injustice because the soul is the important part, and that there's something eternal there. And I think it's a valuable frame in the moment. But it does tie in here because what Gorgias is Socrates engaging with sophists, and speech, the relationship between speech and sophistry and rhetoric, propaganda, we might say, and free speech is a complicated one. And when you allow for free speech, it seems that you necessarily allow for propaganda, because what's propaganda is kind of what's in the eye of the beholder kind of question. So it's a complicated subject, and I don't think there's any easy, simple, we'll just follow the First Amendment rules to solve these problems.
Yeah.
Well, it's ambiguous anyway, so
yeah.
To wrap things back around, as we always do at the end of a show, to practical applications that men can take in their lives today, in the role of either the Father, Striker, or Lord of the Earth. In this case, I think it goes back to Father and Lord of the Earth in terms of the best way to inoculate society in the future from this kind of subversion, so that we have generations that can speak freely, effectively, and actually have a marketplace of ideas. The only way to do that is to raise your kids or your nephews with that in mind.
Yeah, right? And if you speak,
how to engage rhetorically.
Yes, and if you speak with care and respect and thoughtfulness, with a sense of the responsibility that you have to the commons, you actually preserve the degree of free speech that you have, and maybe even expand it, because it is the abuse of it that causes and requires the greater restrictions on free speech. Right. So the more we slow down a little bit and allow ourselves to slow down, not be caught up in the hysteria of urgency, we protect a degree of freedom of speech and inquiry that I think everybody wants at the end of the day. We can acknowledge the need for libel laws and more extensive restrictions like that. But there is an American ethos of free speech that we all care about and we want to protect and participate in. And that's valuable to me. And it's valuable enough to train ourselves to speak well, not so that we can enjoy it by just abusing people in comedic slander, but so that we can say things that matter when it really does matter. when the chips are down, and we said, no, I need to stand up and speak out about this.
Exactly. And the maybe you know Chris, the founding father, who said, was it Jefferson that said that the Constitution was written for a just and moral people?
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea being that for these principles to function, so that when the chips are down, we have a generation that can stand up and speak out, knows how to do that, is to raise a just and moral people, right? That's the fertile ground in which free speech and other very important principles that we for generations have fought for in this country, in which those principles can grow. So
yeah, everything ties together.
Yep. All right, Bulls. Well, we are at an hour. Do we have any final thoughts to wrap up?
No, not really. We could. That should be a lot for people to chew on if they get through all the books we mentioned and all the history. There's another great book called "Let the Students Speak" by David Hudson. That's about basically the history of free speech in colleges and high schools from about the 1940s up to the present. It's a really good, it's a very short overview of the history of how the First Amendment has been interpreted in schools. So just to throw one more recommendation in there for people.
Good stuff, man. If we follow all your recommendations, we'll have a very impressive library within a few episodes.
Yes.
All right, everyone. Have a fantastic evening and stay solar.
Stay solar.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Journal of Solar Culture. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and leave us a comment. The first volume of our journal is available in paperback and now, finally, on Kindle. Pick it up in our store or on Amazon.